Introduction to covalent bonding. How are covalent bonds formed? Covalent bonds are formed by the sharing of electrons between two nonmetals or between metalloid and a nonmetal to have octet of electrons. Again, what is octet of electrons? Means 8 electrons in the outermost shell. Except hydrogen. Hydrogen has 2 electrons. Hydrogen needs to have 2 electrons in the outermost shell to give noble gas configuration of helium. For example, let's take the example of hydrogen molecule H2. Now hydrogen has 1 electron. So we'll take 2 hydrogen atoms. Each has 1 electron. Now each hydrogen shares 1 electron from the other hydrogen. So now each hydrogen has 2 electrons. That makes or that gives each hydrogen atom the noble gas configuration of helium. Now we can write it down this like this also, and 2 electrons, or we can represent 2 electrons as one single line, which we call it as a bond. So this is the covalent structure of H2 molecule. Let's discuss one more, HF. Now HF, hydrogen is a nonmetal, fluorine is a nonmetal. So what type of bonding will be between hydrogen and fluorine? Covalent bonding. Hydrogen in the first state group of the periodic table has 1 valence electron. Fluorine in the 7th state group of the periodic table has 7 valence electrons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now hydrogen needs 1 more electron to become stable, and fluorine needs 1 electron to be stable. So hydrogen shares 1 electron from the fluorine, and now it has 2 electrons in the outermost shell. Fluorine already had 7, so it shares 1 electron from hydrogen, and now fluorine has 8 valence electrons. So how do we draw the bond structure? So the electrons in between, you draw it as a bond, but the rest, let me do it again. But the rest, these electrons, you're going to draw them as lone pairs, because these electrons, these 6 electrons of fluorine are not participating in the bond, and these electrons are known as lone pairs. Now for atoms with 4 or more valence electrons, so let's say if we have carbon has 4 valence electrons because carbon is in the 4th A group, and nitrogen is in the 5th A group, fluorine is in the 7th A group, and oxygen is in the 6th A group. So carbon here, let me see, let me get a color here. So carbon has 4 valence electrons, 1, 2, 3, 4. And how many electrons does it need more to be stable? 4 more electrons. So how many bonds you're going to see around carbon? It is 8 minus number of valence electron, which is 4. So 8 minus 4 is 4. So that's why if you see any structure of carbon, you see 4 bonds around the carbon. Nitrogen is in the 5th A group of the periodic table. That means it has 5 valence electrons. How many bonds nitrogen makes? Again, to find out the number of bonds, you have to do 8 minus number of valence electrons. 8 minus 5 equals to 3. And you will see, for example, this is the structure of ammonia. How many bonds you see around nitrogen? 3. Oxygen for example, oxygen, if we take oxygen has 6 valence electrons because it's in the 6th A group of the periodic table. How many bonds you will see around oxygen? 8 minus 6, which is 2 bonds. Fluorine has 7 electrons, and so 8 minus 7 equals to 1. That's why fluorine makes 1 bond, and that's why when we discussed the structure of HF, we got only 1 bond with the fluorine. How are these covalent compounds named? So you first name the first nonmetal by its element name and the second using the suffix "ide". That's rule number 1. Rule number 2 is add prefixes to show the number of atoms of each element. If the number of atoms is only 1, then we do not write down mono except for carbon monoxide. So let's say if we have a compound NO, so the first element nitrogen, you're going to name it as nitrogen, and oxygen will be oxide. So nitrogen oxide. We have 1 atom of nitrogen, 1 atom of oxygen. For 1 we use mono, but remember we said here mono is omitted. If there will be 2 atoms, it will be di, 3 tri, 4 tetra, 5 penta, 6 hexa, 7 it will be hepta, 8 octa, and 9 nona, and 10 deca. So let's take some more examples. For example, NO2. So the first is nitrogen, so that will be nitrogen, and 2 oxygen dioxide. What about N2O4? Now 2 nitrogens, so dinitrogen tetraoxide. CS2 carbon disulfide. So the difference between ionic and covalent compounds naming is, in ionic compounds we do not put prefixes for the numbers. We don't use di, tri, tetra or penta in ionic compounds, but in covalent compounds you use prefixes to show the number of atoms of each element.
Made with Doodlecast Pro.